The Phoenix Combat Performance Center in Phoenix, Arizona, was packed with professional MMA fighters, wrestling coaches, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes preparing for an upcoming regional championship. Heavy bags echoed through the gym, while fighters drilled takedowns and sparred inside the cages. Sitting quietly on a wooden bench near the edge of the mat was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, loose black training pants, worn wrestling shoes, and carrying an old canvas duffel bag. Leaning beside him rested a polished oak walking cane. Several young fighters assumed he was simply waiting for a family member to finish training. One rising MMA prospect, Jake Lawson, laughed after noticing the old man watching the sparring sessions so attentively. "Careful, Grandpa," he joked loudly. "You'll learn enough to beat us all." The gym erupted in laughter. The elderly man simply smiled and continued observing without saying a word. Moments later, head coach Marcus Hale walked across the mat, stopped in front of the old man, and respectfully bowed before shaking his hand. "Master Daniel Mercer," he said, "we've been hoping you'd visit again." The room fell completely silent. Before anyone could ask another question, Coach Hale turned toward the fighters. "The grappling techniques many of you practice every day," he said calmly, "were introduced into this gym more than 40 years ago by the man sitting in front of you." Resting inside Daniel Mercer's worn canvas duffel bag were decades of handwritten training journals documenting thousands of hours on the mat, along with one sealed letter from the instructor who had first taught him that the strongest fighter is never the one who uses the most force. It is the one who needs the least. The Phoenix Combat Performance Center was alive with energy as professional MMA fighters prepared for one of the biggest regional tournaments of the year. The sound of gloves striking heavy bags echoed throughout the building, while wrestlers practiced takedowns, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes drilled submissions, and coaches shouted instructions from every corner of the gym. Most of the athletes were in their 20s and 30s, competing at the peak of their physical abilities. Near the edge of the main grappling mat, an 80-year-old man quietly sat on a simple wooden bench. He wore a faded gray sweatshirt, loose black training pants, worn wrestling shoes, and leaned lightly on a polished oak walking cane. Resting beside him was an old canvas duffel bag, whose faded fabric suggested it had traveled through countless training halls over many decades. Instead of watching with excitement like a spectator, the elderly man calmly observed every movement on the mat with quiet concentration. His eyes followed foot placement, balance, posture, and timing more than speed or strength. Several younger fighters noticed him sitting there. One whispered, "Probably somebody's grandfather." Another smiled, "Maybe he's waiting for the kids' class." Rising MMA prospect, Jake Lawson glanced toward the old man before laughing with his teammates. "Careful, Grandpa," he called loudly. "Watch long enough, and you'll start coaching us." Laughter spread across the gym. The old man simply smiled politely and gave a small nod before returning his attention to the athletes. A young assistant coach approached him a few moments later. "Good afternoon, sir," she said kindly. "Are you waiting for someone?" The old man smiled warmly. "Just visiting." She nodded. "If you'd like a better seat, we have chairs near the office." He gently shook his head. "Thank you. But this bench has always been my favorite place." She looked slightly confused by his answer but smiled before returning to her duties. Across the gym, the final sparring session of the afternoon was about to begin. Fighters gathered around the cage while head coach Marcus Hale reviewed the training schedule. One of the assistants quietly handed him the visitor log. Marcus looked down at the page, then suddenly froze. His expression immediately changed. "He's here?" Without another word, Marcus walked quickly across the training floor. Every fighter stopped to watch as the respected coach approached the elderly visitor. Reaching the wooden bench, Marcus stood silently for a moment, before giving a respectful bow. Then he extended both hands. "Master Daniel Mercer," he said warmly, "welcome home." Complete silence filled the gym. Jake Lawson looked around in confusion. "Master?" someone whispered. Marcus smiled at the elderly man. "You should have told me you were coming." Daniel chuckled softly. "Then you would have made a fuss." Marcus laughed. "Of course I would." Turning toward the fighters, he raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet the man who built this grappling program long before most of us ever stepped onto a mat." The room fell completely silent. Several older coaches immediately stood straighter. One veteran wrestling instructor quietly removed his cap in respect. Younger fighters exchanged puzzled looks, until one recognized the name from an old photograph hanging in the hallway. Daniel Mercer, he whispered. The founder? Marcus nodded proudly. 45 years ago, before this facility even existed, Master Mercer developed the defensive grappling system that became the foundation of everything we teach here today. Jake Lawson slowly lowered his eyes. The elderly man he had mocked only minutes earlier had shaped the very techniques he trained every day. As Daniel gently lifted his old canvas duffel bag from the floor, the worn zipper accidentally slipped open. Several weathered training journals became visible inside, each carefully labeled by year and filled with handwritten notes stretching back more than 5 decades. Beneath them rested a sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. For Daniel, open this when people finally understand that the strongest fighter is the one who never needs to prove his strength. An uneasy silence settled over the gym. After Coach Marcus Hale introduced Daniel Mercer, the younger fighters exchanged embarrassed glances, while several veteran coaches smiled quietly, remembering the stories they had heard about the legendary grappling instructor years before. Daniel, however, behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He simply picked up his old canvas duffel bag, placed it neatly beside the bench, and continued watching the afternoon training session with calm interest. Marcus turned toward the athletes. Today's sparring schedule is finished, he announced. But before everyone leaves, I'd like you to spend a few minutes speaking with Master Mercer. Most of the fighters nodded respectfully. Jake Lawson remained silent. Although he now understood who the elderly man was, pride still lingered in his expression. Finally, he stepped forward. Coach, he said carefully. I mean, no disrespect. Marcus looked at him. Go ahead. Jake glanced toward Daniel. I know Master Mercer was an incredible coach. He hesitated. But technique change. MMA has evolved. Fighters today are stronger, faster, and more complete than they were decades ago. Several teammates quietly shifted their weight. Sensing where the conversation was heading, Jake continued. I'd honestly like to know whether those old techniques still work against modern fighters. The room became completely silent. Marcus studied Jake for a moment, before looking toward Daniel. Master? He asked politely. Daniel smiled gently. He's asking a fair question. Jake nodded respectfully. I'm not trying to insult you. Daniel chuckled softly. I know. After a brief pause, Jake added, Would you be willing to demonstrate? Marcus immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. Daniel raised one hand. Marcus. The coach stopped speaking. Daniel smiled. Learning should never be discouraged. He slowly stood from the bench, leaning lightly on his oak, walking cane, before setting it carefully against the wall. Walking onto the center of the grappling mat, he removed his faded sweatshirt, revealing a simple black rash guard with no logos or rank patches. His movements were slow but remarkably balanced. Marcus looked toward Jake. There will be no striking. Jake nodded. Agreed. No slams. Agreed. The moment Master Mercer says stop, Jake answered immediately. I stop. Daniel smiled warmly. Good. He stepped onto the mat barefoot and motioned for Jake to approach. The younger fighter stood nearly a head taller and outweighed Daniel by more than 60 pounds. Watching from around the mat, several athletes whispered to one another. This won't last long. Jake's too explosive. Master Mercer shouldn't be doing this at his age. Daniel simply stood with relaxed shoulders and empty hands resting comfortably at his sides. Whenever you're ready, he said calmly. Jake circled cautiously at first, respecting Daniel's reputation, despite the enormous difference in age. Then he shot forward with a controlled wrestling entry, intending only to secure a simple body lock. What happened next lasted less than 2 seconds. Daniel took one small step backward, turned his hips a few inches, lightly redirected Jake's momentum with one hand, and calmly wrapped his other arm beneath Jake's shoulder. There was no sudden burst of strength, no violent throw, no dramatic movement. Jake's balance simply disappeared. Before he understood what had happened, he found himself kneeling on the mat, with his arm gently trapped in a textbook shoulder lock. Daniel applied almost no visible pressure. Even so, Jake immediately felt the submission fully secured. His eyes widened. He tried to move. Nothing worked. Daniel smiled kindly. Don't fight the position. Jake froze. A second later, he tapped the mat 3 times. Complete silence filled the gym. Daniel immediately released the hold and helped Jake back to his feet as though nothing remarkable had happened. Marcus smiled quietly. Did that feel like strength? Jake slowly shook his head, still trying to understand what had just occurred. Daniel adjusted the sleeve of his rash guard before answering for him. No. He smiled gently. It was timing. Just then, one of the veteran coaches quietly walked over and placed Daniel's old canvas duffel bag beside him. As Daniel reached for it, the open zipper revealed another weathered notebook lying beneath the training journals. Resting inside its pages was an old black and white photograph, showing a much younger Daniel Mercer standing beside his own instructor after winning a national grappling championship nearly 50 years earlier. Tucked beneath the photograph rested the same sealed envelope waiting patiently inside the bag, carrying a lesson that no submission technique alone could ever teach. No one in the gym spoke for several long moments. Jake Lawson slowly flexed his shoulder, not because it hurt, but because he still could not understand how someone half his size and more than 50 years older had controlled him so effortlessly. Daniel Mercer stood quietly in the center of the mat, breathing as calmly as if he had never moved at all. There was no celebration, no smile of victory, and certainly no attempt to embarrass the younger fighter. He simply bowed respectfully toward Jake. Jake immediately returned the bow. "Master Mercer," he said honestly, "I never even felt you use strength." Daniel smiled gently. "That's because I wasn't trying to defeat you." Jake looked puzzled. "Then what were you doing?" Daniel pointed toward Jake's feet. "I was listening." Several fighters exchanged confused glances. Daniel continued. "Before your hands touched me, your feet had already told me where you wanted to go." He looked toward the group gathered around the mat. "Your hips agreed. Your shoulders confirmed it. By the time your arms reached me," he smiled softly, "the decision had already been made." Marcus Hale nodded. "That's what we've been trying to teach for years." Daniel chuckled. "And they keep trying to overpower physics." Laughter spread through the gym. Jake shook his head in disbelief. "So you knew exactly what I was going to do?" Daniel gently corrected him. "No." He rested one hand on Jake's shoulder. "I simply recognized what your body had already decided before your mind realized it." One of the younger Brazilian jiu-jitsu athletes raised his hand. "Master Mercer, would that work against anyone?" Daniel smiled. "No technique works against everyone." He paused briefly, but understanding usually works longer than strength. The room became quiet again. Marcus walked toward the wall where dozens of championship photographs decorated the hallway. He pointed to one faded picture, taken nearly 45 years earlier. It showed a young Daniel Mercer standing in the middle of a crowded competition podium surrounded by champions from across the country. "Most people think that's why Master Mercer became famous," Marcus said. Then he shook his head. "They're wrong." He carefully removed another framed photograph hanging beside it. This one showed Daniel wearing a simple tracksuit, kneeling beside a young beginner after practice. He spent the next 40 years producing champions instead of becoming one. Daniel smiled modestly. Winning tournaments lasts for a day. He looked around the gym. Teaching someone how to improve can last for generations. The fighters quietly nodded. Jake looked at Daniel with genuine respect. "Coach always tells us technique beats strength." He smiled. "Today I finally understood what that means." Daniel reached for his old canvas duffel bag and slowly opened one of the weathered training journals. Every page contained handwritten observations rather than lists of victories. Beside sketches of grappling positions were notes such as "relax," "before reacting," "balance is borrowed, not owned," and "if force becomes necessary, understanding arrived too late." Jake stared at the notebook. "You wrote all of that?" Daniel nodded. After every training session, Marcus smiled toward the younger fighters. "That's over 50 years of lessons." As Daniel gently closed the journal, an old black and white photograph slipped onto the mat. Jake quickly bent down and picked it up. The picture showed a much younger Daniel standing beside an elderly Japanese instructor in front of a tiny wooden dojo. Written beneath the photograph were the words, "The day I learned that humility wins longer fights than pride ever could." Jake carefully handed the photograph back. Beneath it, tucked safely inside the notebook, rested the sealed envelope written in elegant blue ink. Across the front were only a few words. "For Daniel, open this when your students finally understand that the greatest victory is helping someone leave the mat wiser than when they stepped onto it." The gym remained completely silent as Daniel Mercer carefully picked up the sealed envelope from inside his weathered training journal. For several moments, he simply looked at the familiar blue handwriting before slowly breaking the old seal. Every fighter gathered around the mat without saying a word. Even the sound of heavy bags had stopped. Daniel adjusted his reading glasses and began reading aloud. "Dear Daniel, if you are opening this letter, then your students have finally discovered that real martial arts were never about defeating people. They were always about defeating the part of ourselves that believes victory makes us superior. He paused briefly before continuing. One day, you will become slower. Younger fighters will be stronger, faster, and more athletic than you. Accept that with gratitude. If your knowledge disappears when your strength does, then you were never teaching martial arts. You were only teaching youth. Several young fighters quietly lowered their eyes. Daniel unfolded the second page. Never measure a fighter by how many opponents he can submit. Measure him by how many people leave his presence more disciplined, more humble, and more confident than when they arrived. Jake Lawson listened without moving. Daniel smiled softly before reading the next paragraph. There will always be athletes who believe power comes from muscles. Let them train. Time will become your assistant. One day they will discover that technique survives long after strength begins to fade. The room became completely silent. Daniel carefully unfolded the final page. If anyone ever asks you what the highest level of martial arts truly is, do not show them your trophies. Show them your students. A champion proves what one person can achieve. A teacher proves what many people can become. Daniel quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside the journal. No one spoke for several long moments. Finally, Marcus Hale stepped forward. "Master," he said softly, "everything we teach in this gym began with those lessons." Daniel smiled gently. "No." He looked around the room. "It began with my teacher." Marcus laughed quietly. Exactly what he would have expected you to say. At that moment, the lights near the entrance dimmed slightly, as the staff uncovered a large display that had remained hidden behind a curtain. Inside a polished glass case rested Daniel's faded gray sweatshirt, worn wrestling shoes, polished oak walking cane, weathered canvas duffel bag, handwritten training journals spanning more than 50 years, the black and white photograph with his instructor, and the letter he had just read aloud. At the center of the display stood a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Daniel Mercer, Martial Arts Legacy," dedicated to the teacher who proved that the greatest technique is the one that leaves both people standing with greater respect than before. Every fighter in the gym instinctively stood in silence. Then, one by one, they bowed toward Daniel, not because he had submitted a younger athlete, but because they finally understood that true mastery is never demonstrated by humiliating an opponent. It is revealed by the quiet ability to transform every challenge into a lesson, every victory into humility, and every student into someone better than they were the day before that day. The story of Daniel Mercer quickly spread throughout the martial arts community. At first, social media clips showed an 80-year-old man calmly submitting a young professional MMA fighter with a single effortless shoulder lock. Millions watched the video in disbelief, amazed that someone of Daniel's age could control a younger athlete so easily. But as coaches, fighters, and martial artists learned who Daniel Mercer truly was, the story became far more than a viral demonstration. It became a lesson about discipline, humility, and the timeless value of mastering fundamentals before chasing power. 1 year later, the United States Martial Arts Coaches Association invited Daniel to deliver the opening address at its annual instructors conference. Hundreds of MMA coaches, wrestling instructors, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu professors, judo masters, amateur athletes, and professional champions filled the auditorium, expecting a seminar on advanced submissions or competition strategy. Instead, Daniel walked onto the stage carrying only his weathered canvas duffel bag. He slowly opened it and removed the oldest of his handwritten training journals. Looking across the silent audience, he smiled gently before reading the first sentence written on the opening page more than 50 years earlier. "Win the position before you think about winning the fight." He quietly closed the journal again. "People often ask me what the strongest submission I ever learned was," he began. "The truth is," he smiled softly, "it wasn't a submission at all." The audience listened without moving. "The strongest technique I ever learned was patience." He rested one hand on the journal, because patience allows you to see opportunities that force never notices. Complete silence filled the auditorium. Daniel continued, "The greatest mistake young fighters make is believing martial arts are about proving who is better." He looked around the room. "They're not." His voice remained calm. "Martial arts exist to help you become better than the person you were yesterday." Marcus Hale, seated in the front row, quietly smiled. Those words reminded him of the afternoon when an elderly master had taught an entire gym that true strength is measured by self-control rather than domination. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the association unveiled the Daniel Mercer Martial Arts Learning Center, created to preserve the philosophy that had shaped generations of athletes. Inside the exhibit rested Daniel's faded gray sweatshirt, worn wrestling shoes, polished oak walking cane, weathered canvas duffel bag, handwritten training journals, the photograph with his instructor, and the letter that had guided his entire career. Visitors expected the first display to showcase championship medals or famous victories. Instead, they found a single handwritten question displayed beneath soft lighting. Are you trying to defeat your opponent or your own ego? Every new instructor entering the learning center was invited to spend several minutes reflecting on that question before teaching a single class. Years later, after Daniel Mercer peacefully passed away at the age of 95, fighters and coaches from around the world gathered for a memorial. Unlike any major martial arts event, there were no championship belts displayed, no tournament highlights, and no discussions about titles. Instead, one by one, instructors quietly placed handwritten lesson plans beside Daniel's portrait, promising to continue teaching respect before technique, discipline before victory, and humility before recognition. Above the entrance to the Daniel Mercer Martial Arts Learning Center, a bronze inscription welcomed every future martial artist with the words that would forever define his legacy. Technique controls the body, character controls the person using it. True mastery begins where the need to prove yourself ends. Those who visited the center often admired the old sweatshirt, the weathered journals, and the faded photograph that had traveled through more than half a century of training. But those who truly understood Daniel Mercer's life realized that his greatest achievement had never been submitting a young fighter or creating a successful grappling system. It was teaching generations of martial artists that the highest level of combat is not found in overpowering another human being. It is found in developing the wisdom to know when strength is unnecessary. The story of Daniel Mercer soon spread far beyond the walls of the Phoenix Combat Performance Center. At first, millions of people watched the viral video of an 80-year-old man calmly submitting a young professional MMA fighter with what appeared to be almost no effort. But as coaches, athletes, and martial artists discovered who Daniel Mercer truly was, the story became far more than an impressive display of technique. It became a reminder that the greatest masters are not recognized by how many opponents they defeat, but by how many people they inspire to become better human beings. In the years that followed, Daniel's story was shared in wrestling rooms, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies, judo dojos, military training centers, police defensive tactics programs, and MMA gyms throughout the world. Not because he had once been a champion, not because he could still submit younger fighters at the age of 80, but because he proved that true mastery survives long after youth, speed, and physical strength begin to fade. Whenever young fighters asked Daniel what the secret behind his technique was, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "My technique isn't faster than yours," he would say. "I simply stopped fighting my opponent years ago. I started working with the mistakes he was already making." During his final public seminar, Daniel walked onto the mat carrying only his weathered canvas duffel bag. Instead of demonstrating spectacular throws or complicated submissions, he quietly placed a plain white training belt in the center of the mat. Hundreds of fighters sat in complete silence. Daniel looked at the belt for a moment before speaking. "Every black belt," he said, "began here." He paused and smiled gently. "The tragedy is that some people forget what this belt was trying to teach them." He slowly picked up the white belt and held it in both hands. A white belt is not a symbol of ignorance. He looked around the room. It is a promise that you are still willing to learn. The entire gym remained perfectly still. Daniel carefully folded the belt and placed it back inside the duffel bag. "The day you believe there is nothing left to learn," he continued softly, "is the day your training truly ends. No matter how often you still step onto the mat." Before leaving, he shared one final sentence that would later be engraved above the entrance to the Daniel Mercer Martial Arts Learning Center. "The purpose of martial arts is not to create people who can win fights. It is to create people who no longer need to prove they can." Years after Daniel Mercer peacefully passed away, his faded gray sweatshirt, worn wrestling shoes, polished oak walking cane, weathered canvas duffel bag, handwritten journals, and the letter from his teacher remained preserved inside the learning center that now carried his name. Visitors often admired the stories of the legendary master who could still submit athletes half a century younger than himself, but those who truly understood Daniel's life realized that his greatest victory had never taken place on a competition mat. His greatest victory was helping thousands of students discover that the strongest person in any room is rarely the loudest, the fastest, or the most intimidating. It is the one who possesses enough confidence to remain humble, enough skill to remain gentle, and enough wisdom to walk away from proving something that no longer needs to be proven.